Hello and welcome to the Royal Air Force Museum Research Lectures. I'm Dr. Harry Rafael, and tonight we're joined by people from Alabama, Athens, and even Abergavenny. Wherever you are joining us from around the world, welcome. Yeah, Tom, we've gone global. Really excited about it. It's our last lecture of 2020. Our call for papers for the 2021 series is up and online. I'm going to post a link to it later. But if you're interested in giving a paper, you're very welcome to email me. But I'm really pleased that tonight, for our last lecture, we've got Tom Hopkins presenting. He's a curator at Cosford. He joined at the start of 2019. Before then, he worked in collections management at the History of Science Museum, University of Oxford. He has an MA from the University of Birmingham in classics, so a seamless transition through to Coastal Command, which is my favourite of all commands, I have to confess. So really excited about the talk. Before we begin though, a number of you have emailed me and said that you've really enjoyed the online lectures, but you hope that they'll continue into 2021, which I can assure you they will, using Crowdcast. And you've also asked how you can support the museum, which again is really nice. It's not expected. We haven't, I'm out of focus apparently. I'm sorry, John, I won't be on for very much longer. So how you can support the museum. We don't talk about it very often because the idea of the lectures is to present the research freely, and if you can't afford to support it, we really don't mind. If you are interested in supporting us, I'm going to post a link now as to how you can do that. You could also just buy your Christmas presents from our shop. It's really up to you, but it's delightful if some of you want to help out. So I shall shortly post the link. But I'm going to introduce Tom now. He's going to come up with his slides. So Tom, I'm going to bring you on. There you are.
Thank you very much, Harry, for that very warm introduction. If you can get the introduction slide up, and then I can begin. Super. Right, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on RAF Coastal Command in the early stages of the Cold War. Essentially, looking at why cuts to Coastal Command following the end of the Second World War were pretty severe, but not quite as severe as those following cuts to coastal area at the end of the First World War. So although the title was Cold War, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the interwar period as well in this presentation. If we could have the next slide, please, Harry. Thank you. So I'll begin. Enemy submarine activity, especially attacks against merchant shipping, posed a huge threat to Britain in the First World War. The Allies responded successfully to this threat in a number of ways. Maritime aviation was part of that response. While instances of aircraft directly sinking or significantly damaging enemy submarines were very rare, merely keeping aircraft flying over vital sea lanes acted as a deterrent and forced submarines to remain submerged. Come the end of the First World War, and submarines seem to have been largely forgotten by defence planners. Instead, the emphasis remained on big capital surface ships. If the Navy were more interested in fighting on rather than under the water, the Royal Air Force was more interested in attacking targets on land. In the interwar period, thinking on air power was dominated by ideas of offensive air forces that would take the fight to the enemy. Maritime aviation was largely neglected and very little thought given to anti-submarine warfare and its potential delivery from the air. This meant that Britain was very ill prepared for the Battle of the Atlantic in the Second World War. As in the First War, defeat of the enemy submarine threat was brought about by a range of factors, many of which had to be relearned by forces ill prepared for the challenge ahead. By the second half of the Second World War, however, aircraft were playing a much more vital function than they had in the First World War. Not only were they acting as a deterrent, they're also now much more capable of destroying enemy submarines. As in the period immediately after the First War, that following the Second War saw huge cuts to defence expenditure. RAF Coastal Command was no exception to this. With the U-boats gone, Maritime patrol aircraft were repurposed for air policing and supply duties across the world. Cold water had been poured onto Coastal Command's specialised anti-submarine warfare functions that were perfected during the Second World War. There were 21 years of peace between November 1918 and September 1939. The period between the end of the Second World War and the ill-defined beginning of the Cold War was far shorter. Both periods, however, saw rapid defence cuts, followed by rapid rearmament as new political tensions materialised. But if anti-submarine aviation had been completely neglected after the First War, the lessons learned after the Second World War did not altogether fade. As the enemy submarine threat re-emerged in the early 1950s, this time from the Soviets, the RAF and the Royal Navy, although much reduced in size, were not taken quite on the same back foot as they had been 10 years earlier. This presentation will examine the various factors that explain this. The confidence the RAF had in 1945 as a mature and proven service, in contrast with their insecure position in 1918, and the differing attitudes to submarines, both public and military, at the end of both wars, and the changing capabilities of both submarines and anti-submarine aircraft. Can we have the next slide, please? It may be useful to begin this discussion by comparing the size of the cuts that were faced by British maritime aviation elements in both post-war periods. The size of coastal air power at the end of the First World War could be counted in thousands of aircraft, but by 1924, coastal area were equipped with just 11 flying boats. By 1933, the situation had improved, but only slightly, with 4 squadrons of flying boats based in Britain and an additional 2 squadrons of torpedo bombers based in Singapore. Squadrons at this time typically comprised around 12 aircraft. By the outbreak of the Second World War, this had risen to 19 squadrons, still severely under strength. By 1941, however, this would rise to 36 home-based squadrons with additional units operating from Gibraltar, Iceland, and West Africa. At the close of the war, Coastal Command operated 511 maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Cuts occurred to Coastal Command strength almost immediately following victory in Europe Day, with the second wave following victory in Japan Day 3 months later. However, there would be no return to the levels of 1924, at least until the last of the RAF Nimrods were retired from service in 2010. After VJ Day, American Lend-Lease types, such as the PBY Catalina and the B-24 Liberator, were amongst the first aircraft to be withdrawn, in some cases replaced by surplus Lancasters. The veteran Short Sunderland, which first flew in 1937, would remain in active RAF service until the end of the 1950s. From 1952 until 1957, the RAF operated the American-built Lockheed Neptune, before sufficient numbers of the British-built Avro Shackletons could be brought into service. The nadir of the post-Second World War strength of Coastal Command would come in 1946, with only around 8 operational squadrons. This figure would rise to around 19 in 1954. This is a far cry from the situation of the 1920s and early 1930s. This contrast becomes even starker when we look beyond the numbers alone and consider the capabilities of aircraft. A typical flying boat of the 1920s, such as the submarine Southampton, had a top speed of 95 miles an hour, a range of 540 miles, endurance of 6.3 hours, and an armament of 3 303 machine guns and 1,000 pounds of ordnance, none of which would have been capable of sinking an enemy submarine in all but the most exceptional circumstances. The Avro Shackleton, by contrast, had a top speed of 300 miles an hour, a range of over 2,200 miles, an endurance of 14.5 hours, and an armament of 2 20mm cannon and up to 10,000 pounds of bombs, depth charges, mines, and torpedoes. At best, the Southampton was a scarecrow to enemy submarines. whereas the Shackleton was a real killer, fielding tried and tested weapons. To really understand why Coastal Command managed to survive the post-1945 defence cuts, whereas Coastal Command's predecessor, was nearly completely wiped out by the post-1918 cuts, we need to look back to the U-boat campaign of the First World War and explore why its severity seems to have been completely forgotten by defence planners of the early interwar period. Next slide, please. Sorry, that was supposed to come up earlier. Could we have the next slide now, please, Harry? Thank you. The German U-boat campaign against Britain during the First World War is almost wholly eclipsed in the public memory by the mud and the trenches of the Western Front. Certainly Gallipoli, Jutland and the Arab Revolt are better known. If we remember U-boats at all, it's probably for the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in May 1915 and its long-lasting legacy. But the U-boat attacks against trade represented a huge threat to the Allied war effort and was the cause of serious concern. Each year until 1917, the tonnage of shipping lost to German submarines increased exponentially, with the highest losses recorded in April of that year at nearly 900,000 tons. By way of comparison, monthly Allied losses never reached these levels, although they did get close during the Second World War. Overall, the Allies lost just under 13 million tons of merchant shipping during the First World War, compared to just under 15 tons in the Atlantic during the Second World War. The Allies have been accused of being slow to address the underwater menace, but gradually the tide was turned. New inventions such as hydrophones and depth charges were introduced. ASDIC, now more commonly known by its American name of sonar, was still in its infancy at the end of the war, but showed promise. Q-ships, although a propaganda victory, as an example of British ingenuity striking back, were perhaps less effective. Most significant of all was probably the introduction of the convoy system. But maritime aviation also had its part to play. During 1915, the Royal Navy introduced its first airship designed specifically for anti-submarine patrol work, with repurposed aircraft fuselages as cars and fabric for gas compartments provided by a raincoat manufacturer. By the end of 1917, the Navy were operating over 100 so-called blimps. These proved to have greater endurance and more reliability than the fixed-wing aircraft available during the first half of the war, although they were relatively slow. The Royal Navy Air Service also began using Curtiss-designed seaplanes. More able flying boats, such as the Felixstowe F2, with an endurance of 6 hours and a top speed of 96 miles an hour, were introduced in 1917. The first effective land-based maritime patrol aircraft, the Blackburn Kangaroo, the absence of an unaerodynamic hull giving it a significantly better performance than a flying boat, was introduced in 1918, with an endurance of 8 hours and a top speed of 98 miles an hour. The honour of being the nation whose aircraft first sank, unassisted, an enemy submarine fell not to the British, but to the Austrians, who had some success against British and French vessels in the clear waters of the Adriatic. The first probable British sinking of an enemy submarine from an aircraft came on the 22nd of September 1917, when a Curtiss seaplane likely sank the German vessel UB-32. This is also likely the only known instance of a British aircraft sinking a submarine unassisted in the course of the war. Of course, many more claims for kills of enemy submarines were made at the time than could be backed up by later post-war analysis. Did the vessel sink, or had it just submerged? But if doubt existed as to the effectiveness of aircraft as anti-submarine platforms during the First World War period, it's worth remembering that their true value lied in their deterrence factor. A U-boat commander, not knowing what sort of armament is carried by an aircraft when he spots it, or how effective it may be, is nonetheless compelled to submerge. Operating on batteries at much reduced speed and range, he's forced to dive. His vessel, an instrument of trade war, is rendered almost obsolete during the time that he must remain under the waves. Passive or scarecrow patrolling from the air was therefore a key element in the integrated struggle against U-boats during the First World War, albeit the one that was very quickly forgotten after the end of hostilities. Could we have the next slide, please? Some elements of the British military leadership never had the warmest attitude to submarines as a weapon of war. In 1901, Admiral Arthur Wilson had famously described them as underhanded, unfair, and damned un-English. We should treat all submarines as pirate vessels in wartime and will hang the crews. Although Wilson was later involved in the introduction of submarines into the Royal Navy. The slang term for the submarine service, the trade, which was in widespread circulation from before 1916, may also indicate the projection of class prejudices. Battleships may be dashing, gentlemanly, and aristocratic, but submarines sneaky and common. Nevertheless, with the support of modernizers like Jackie Fisher, Britain entered the First World War with more submarines than any other power, although Germany was soon to catch up. Evidence of a cooling towards submarines can be seen in later building programs. In January 1932, Britain had 52 submarines in service compared to 81, 65, and 67 for the USA, France, and Japan, respectively. These ratios would remain similar into 1939, although by then the Italian and German production had skyrocketed. Britain was still focusing on big capital ships. Perhaps the clearest evidence for Britain's lack of enthusiasm for submarines was the Admiralty's proposal to totally abolish submarines altogether, as was proposed at the Washington Naval Conference between 1921 and 1922. Such a move was rejected in the face of fierce French opposition and was both a cause and a symptom of cooling relationships between the two nations. Another dimension worth exploring is the fate of Germany's U-boats following the end of the war. Germany was specifically banned from building any U-boats under the terms of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Prior to this, under the terms of the armistice, Germany was ordered to surrender their existing fleet in its entirety. If the British were not too keen on operating submarines themselves, they certainly didn't want any other potential enemy to have use of them, and her allies agreed. In November 1918, more than 160 German U-boats were surrendered at Harwich, and at one point they stretched more than 2 miles down the Essex coast. The eventual fate of these vessels is also telling. The vast majority were sold off to breakers' yards, stripped of engines or any other useful components, and turned into scrap. The engines were often the most valuable commodities and ended up being used for a wide variety of tasks. Many were employed for municipal power generation, while a few went to industries such as brewing. A smaller number were commissioned into the navies of some of the victorious powers. At least 9 were delivered to France, where they were given new crews and names. A yet smaller number went to Japan and the USA. But although it had been a British port that had been the marshalling point for the surrendered U-boats, none at all were put into Royal Navy service. Those U-boats that remained in British waters but managed to avoid the breakers' yard, at least for the time being, were put to an altogether different use. At least 29 were exhibited at various coastal port towns and cities across the country, where members of the public could pay a fee to board these intriguing vessels. One town, Hastings, even received a U-boat by accident. This is the one pictured here on the slide. U-118, which was to be transferred to France, broke tow during a storm on the 15th of April 1919 and washed up onto the town's beach. An enterprising member of the town council decided to charge a fee to the public to climb aboard the U-boat's deck, which raised nearly £300 for Hastings veterans. Tours inside the vessel were conducted for VIPs by two members of the Coast Guard. However, both men died within months. Chlorine gas from flooded batteries was suspected and public access soon curtailed. In another tragic incident in September 1921, 5 apprentices were killed at Birkenhead while working on U-155. This vessel had been acquired by the MP and later convicted fraudster Horatio Bottomley with the intention of touring it commercially. Such tragedies aside, it appears that in the post-war climate, the British public were more interested in submarines than the Admiralty were. The main uses the Navy made of German U-boats were in small numbers of gunnery and explosive trials, most notably the group of U-boats still visible in shallow tides at Pendennis near Falmouth in Cornwall, and a single instance of a German U-boat engine being repurposed for fitting into a British submarine. The Admiralty entered the interwar period with a continuing interest in big capital ships and little interest in either operating their own submarines or countering those of a future enemy. The threat to Britain's trade from submarines was not altogether forgotten, but too much emphasis was put on developments in ASDIC, and a spirit of complacency flourished. The convoy system, which had proved so effective, was also fast becoming a distant memory. In what Captain Stephen Roskill describes as an astonishing omission, not one exercise in the protection of a slow mercantile convoy against submarine or air attack took place at all between 1919 and 1939. And yet the blame for this complacency cannot be said to lie solely at the doors of the Admiralty. At a higher, albeit advisory level, the Committee on the Imperial Defence issued a statement on the 25th of November 1937 saying that we must be prepared for unrestricted attack by submarine against our trade, more particularly by Germany. But we do not visualise that the submarine will constitute the menace that it did in 1914 to 18. Our anti-submarine measures, together with the assistance afforded by air reconnaissance, should provide adequate protection. As we'll go on to see, though, the Air Ministry was also far from blameless when it comes to astonishing omissions in planning for strategic and tactical priorities. Could we have the next slide, please? The Royal Air Force was formed as an independent service in April 1918 through the merger of the Royal Navy Air Service and the Army's Royal Flying Corps. This merger came after the publication of the influential Smuts Report in 1917, on the back of a wide-scale public panic at the intensification of German bombing raids the previous year. While largely born out of a need to better organise the air defence of Great Britain, the Smuts Report also provided encouragement to those who thought the British should make more proactive use of their own bombers, and on a strategic rather than a tactical level. The report stated, "The day may not be far off when aerial operations, with their devastation of enemy lands and destruction of industrial and popular centres on a vast scale, may become the principal operations of war, to which the older forms of military and naval operations may become secondary and subordinate." Smuts' prediction chimes with those made by theorists such as F.W. Lanchester and later the Italian Giulio Douhet. Amongst the Air Ministry's top brass, the doctrine of massed bomber offences as the new way to wage war soon became common currency. For those who had experience, who had experienced the static nature of trench warfare on the Western Front, this change in direction must have been an attractive one, promising as it did a swifter and more decisive model for waging war. Adoption of this doctrine as the policy of the RAF meant the introduction of a large homogeneous force of bombers that would allow for the maximum possible concentration of force. The introduction of aircraft or units designed for maritime defence or army cooperation would be a distraction from this key role, and the Air Ministry was not keen to prioritise it. Aside from the firm belief that offensive strategic bombing was the future of warfare, and that to develop it as a military capability was in Britain's best interest, the Air Ministry's decision was also a political one. The War Office and the Admiralty were still resentful from the loss of their air elements to the newly formed RAF. Still fighting for its survival as an independent service, the RAF was bound to latch onto any idea that gave it exclusive rights to field a potentially war-winning weapon. The implications of this for Britain's maritime air power would be profound, and the cuts to RAF coastal area were far more sweeping than those seen by the rest of the service amongst the post-war contraction of defence spending. However, it was not just the cut in numbers that damaged coastal areas' capabilities. It was also the change in their operational focus that took place during the 1920s. With no enemy submarines to contend with, the RAF used their force of flying boats for imperial cruising and policing activities. To an extent, flying boats were well designed for this role, since they didn't need the expensive infrastructure, such as airfields, to operate across the furthest reaches of the British Empire. They also allowed the RAF to win one over the army through a policy of so-called substitution, showing that a mobile garrison and police force, like flying boats, was significantly cheaper to operate than thousands of boots on the ground. But whatever political points might be scored, the reality was that the RAF had lost almost all of its maritime patrol and strike proficiency. Remember that its nadir in 1924, coastal area could just wield just 11 flying boats. Much would have to be relearned before the British could face the renewed U-boat menace of the Second World War. Could we have the next slide, please? Retelling the Battle of the Atlantic is well beyond the scope of this presentation, but there are a few salient points which should be discussed before considering why Coastal Command did not suffer the same swinging cuts post-1945 the coastal area did post-1918. Broadly speaking, there had been little change in the capability of submarines between 1918 and 1939. To a certain extent, the same could be said for maritime patrol aircraft. The Avro Anson was a monoplane and the first RAF aircraft to be fitted with a retractable undercarriage, and its enclosed cabin must have provided some comfort to its crew. However, compared to the Blackburn Kangaroo, the Anson was, yes, it was 100 miles an hour faster, but it only had 2/3 of its endurance. The Anson could also carry no bomb heavier than 100 pounds, and it was not equipped with depth charges, even though both trials and experience had proven that 100-pound bombs would be too weak to do anything more than scratch a U-boat. And in 1939, the Anson was Coastal Command's most numerous aircraft type. It's perhaps telling that in the course of the war, there was not a single case of an Anson sinking a U-boat. Other aircraft proved more capable, however. The Hudson was slightly better and filled an important gap before more able aircraft, such as the Catalina and Liberator, could be introduced. The Sunderland, too, could hold its own, although they were relatively expensive and time-consuming to build, with production never exceeding 5 airframes per month. But aircraft alone cannot tell the story of why, from May 1943, the Allies began once again to turn the tide against German U-boats. There was also new developments, such as more sophisticated radar, homing torpedoes, the Lee light, more sophisticated depth charges, 3-inch rockets, as well as ultra and new tactics. A range of various factors came together and matured to make the Allied anti-U-boat campaign more and more effective, and Coastal Command was a very active agent in all of this. By 1941, Coastal Command was attributed with just 2 kills of enemy submarines. By the end of the war, shore-based aircraft were responsible for 41.5% of all submarine kills, and of these, Coastal Command were responsible for more than half. In the First World War, nobody could seriously doubt the importance of maritime aviation for its scarecrow effect on U-boat operations. The true can be said for Coastal Command's efforts in the first 2 years of the Second World War. Although types like the Anson have widely been described as obsolescent by 1939, they still had their part to play in being a deterrent. But it was developments later in the war that really show the potential of aircraft as anti-submarine platforms, not merely deterring enemy vessels, but also more than capable of destroying them. To a large extent, there is reason to be grateful for the continuing development of aircraft capabilities during the course of the Second World War. Although May 1943 is widely stated as a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat threat never really went away. For every development the Allies made with radar, the Germans would come up with countermeasures, such as METOX or Naxos. Experiments were made with fitting U-boats with increasingly deadly anti-aircraft armament, and the Schnorkel allowed a boat to use its more powerful diesel engines even when submerged. The Type 21 and 23 U-boats, which began to be produced towards the end of the war, had a truly impressive performance. Allied vessels were still being sunk even hours before VE Day. Along with so much of the German military engineering, evolution and innovation continued apace despite ever-decreasing resources. These continuing developments are important in considering how the Allies would respond to the threats of enemy submarines in the post-war world, and would come into sharper focus as the Soviets emerged as a new foe in the late 1940s. Next slide, please. Earlier, we discussed how, at the end of the First World War, Britain emerged with the largest submarine fleet in the world, but had no intention of expanding it and even sought to ban submarines altogether. There was no real interest in assessing captured submarines scientifically, and a large number were turned into exhibition pieces. The situation at the end of the Second World War was rather different. A number of German U-boats were displayed by the Allies at the end of the war, but there were only around 4 such vessels compared to the 29 so employed in 1918 to 1919. Significantly, a far larger number appeared to have been taken on post-1945 as trials vessels, with the Americans, British, French, and Soviets each acquiring at least one example of a Type 21 U-boat. For instance, U-3017 was commissioned into the Royal Navy as N41 and used for testing before being broken up in November 1949. Design elements taken from the Type 21 U-boat would subsequently be incorporated into the Porpoise class, Britain's first submarines of the post-war period, construction of which began in 1956. Type 21s would also prove the inspiration behind the American Tang class and the Soviet Whiskey class of submarines, construction of which began in 1949 and 1950, respectively. Other avenues of naval research into surrendered German vessels led to less profitable results. U-4107 was an experimental submarine built around an engine fueled by high-test peroxide. Although it had been scuttled by its crew, it was raised, commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Meteorite, and taken to Barrow and Furness. Trials commenced under the supervision of the engine's designer, Helmut Walter, and 2 further experimental vessels, HMS Explorer and HMS Excalibur, were developed around peroxide propulsion. However, these vessels proved unpopular with their crews, being described as only about 75% safe, and HMS Explorer soon gained the nickname HMS Exploder. Ultimately, this technology went nowhere, but it does perhaps indicate more willingness to experiment on behalf of the Admiralty than had been the case at the end of the First World War. The Royal Navy ended the Second World War with 131 submarines. By 1950, this had fallen to 66, and by 1960, just 54. This fall in numbers should, however, be seen in the face of the stringent post-war cuts to the defence budget. As a proportion of combat vessels available, submarines would actually increase, in a trend that continued until around 1980, by which time submarines represented over a quarter of Royal Navy vessels then in service. At the end of the First World War, the Admiralty had prioritised investments in battleships at the expense of submarines. At the end of the Second World War, that doctrine had been completely turned on its head. Only one battleship would be commissioned into the Royal Navy after the end of the Second World War, and by 1960, none would be left in British service. Next slide, please. If the attitudes of the Admiralty towards submarines can be said to have changed between 1918 and 1945, can the same be said of the Air Ministry? To an extent they can, by looking back at the comparisons drawn earlier between the cuts made to coastal area or coastal command in immediate post-First and post-Second World War periods. A post-Second World War nadir of 8 operational squadrons in 1946 of tried and tested aircraft types was certainly more respectable than the 11 flying boats fielded in 1924. By the time the Soviets developed a true blue water navy in the mid-1950s, coastal command strength had more than doubled from the level of 1946. What caused the Air Ministry to change tack? The RAF had emerged from the Second World War as a fully mature service. Not only had it emerged as an effective component in the Battle of the Atlantic, it also laid solo claim to the nation's salvation during the Battle of Britain in 1940. The use of tactical air power had been proven in both North Africa and Northwestern Europe, and the magnitude of the strategic bombing effort was widely known, even if its legacy and analysis would prove more complex and controversial. The RAF simply was not facing the same existential crisis post-1945 that it had post-1918. It was no longer having to fight for its very survival by latching onto the one military doctrine it alone was capable of, the massed offensive strategic bombing. In any case, as Britain began developing its own nuclear weapons in the 1950s, it became clear that the RAF would be the only force able to deliver them. Of course, inter-service rivalry still existed after 1945 and into the Cold War, but they were nowhere near as intense as they had been in the early interwar period. To an extent, they've been mollified by the formation of the Fleet Air Arm in 1937 and the Army Air Corps in first 1942, and then its reformation again in 1957, giving back control to the Navy and the Army of those air elements most central to their operations. Another fact was undoubtedly the simple fact that the Royal Navy and the RAF had to learn to work with each other during the Battle of the Atlantic. While debates over the command and control of maritime air assets initially caused differences between the two services, the formation of Joint Area Combined Headquarters allowed naval and air staff to eventually work out their differences and foster a positive and effective working relationship to ensure the proper prosecution of the trade defence mission, to quote a recent analysis made by Dr. Richard Curator. To a large degree, these differences became academic once Coastal Command proved itself to be more than just a scarecrow towards the second half of the Second World War. The lessons learned from the Joint Area Combined Headquarters not only went a long way to foster positive working relationships between the two services, but they also had legacies for other joint operations and commands, including those used by NATO. Such joint operations also enjoyed a legacy closer to home. The Anti-Submarine Warfare Development Unit was based at RAF Thorney Island from between 1945 and 1957. This included a naval element and worked on the development of radar and acoustic technologies. The Joint Anti-Submarine School was formed at Londonderry and provided annual courses to officers from both RAF Coastal Command, the Fleet Air Arm, and personnel drawn from surface ships and submarines of the Royal Navy. The records of both institutions reside with the National Archives at Kew and should provide a rich ground for future research. Certainly, they should shed light on the fact that both the RAF and the Royal Navy were devoting far more resources to the further development of anti-submarine warfare in the late 1940s and 1950s than they had in the entirety of the interwar period. Although the threat of enemy submarines was negligible between 1945 and the early 1950s, Coastal Command was kept alive by more than the foresight of defence planners, who were looking nervously towards the Soviet Union. The command was kept busy through a whole range of what has been described as reinforcement missions during the early Cold War. As in the interwar period, Coastal Command undertook Imperial air policing roles. However, unlike the substitution missions of the 1920s and 1930s, which were designed in part to prove that the RAF could provide a far more cost-effective means of garrisoning the empire than the army, itself part of the RAF plan to justify its very existence. The reinforcement missions of the post-1945 world seem a genuine attempt to make the best use of dwindling resources in order to further British interests. One excellent example of Coastal Command being put to good use for a role other than hunting enemy submarines was the role played by Short Sunderland during the Berlin airlift. The Berlin blockade began in June 1948 and has been recognised as one of the first real flashpoints of the Cold War. While American and British Dakotas and Yorks, amongst other aircraft types, were able to meet the majority of the besieged city's requirements for food and coal, the transport of salt represented unique difficulties on account of the corrosive effect it demonstrates to metal airframes. The Sunderland, very much designed with marine operations in mind, was one of the few aircraft that could offer a degree of resistance to salt corrosion. Landing on the Havel and Elbe rivers, up to 12 Sunderlands worked to transport this important commodity into Berlin until May 1949. 3 squadrons of Sunderlands also represented one of the RAF's few contributions to the Korean War. Operating from Japan, they would return to a chiefly maritime patrol role, looking out for and intercepting blockade runners. All of this meant that by the time enemy submarines re-emerged as a threat, chiefly through the introduction of the Soviet Whiskey class, Coastal Command was there to meet and respond to that challenge. We can only hypothesize about how combat between submarines of the Soviet Navy and aircraft of the Royal Air Force, and assisted by ships of the Royal Navy, may have turned out. But with a prevailing spirit of cooperation between the two services, and commitments by both to continuing technological development, it is right to describe Coastal Command as the only RAF force in daily contact with the enemy during the Cold War. Next slide, please. To conclude, we've seen how both world wars ended with periods of massive cuts to Britain's defence expenditure. Maritime aviation was very much a victim of both sets of cuts, both to coastal area in the post-1918 period and to Coastal Command in the post-1945 period. However, the shrinking of Britain's maritime air power was far more severe during the first set of cuts than it was during the second. This presentation has attempted to explore a number of explanations for why this was, and I've summarised some of the main points below. Firstly, we saw how attitudes to the operation of and provisions for defence from submarines was very different in Admiralty circles between the post-1918 period and post-1945 period. Anti-submarine warfare was woefully neglected during the interwar period, but this mistake does not seem to have been repeated after 1945. Secondly, post-1918, the RAF was preoccupied by the struggle for its very survival, which forced it to latch onto doctrines that it felt best served that interest. This ultimately resulted in the loss of certain key capabilities, especially those involved with close cooperation with the Navy and Army, amongst a context of bitter inter-service rivalry. Thirdly, the spirit of cooperation that was forced upon the Navy and the RAF through the Joint Area Combined Headquarters during the Battle of the Atlantic did much to dispel inter-service rivalries, as did the RAF's gradual abandonment of the principle of the indivisibility of air power, showing through the concessions made to the Fleet Air Arm and the Army Air Corps. Fourthly, the post-1945 world presented various unique challenges that kept Coastal Command elements busy during the period immediately prior to the emergence of the Soviet submarine threat. As the Soviet Union gradually developed an increasingly sophisticated blue water navy throughout the 1950s, Coastal Command was not caught off guard in quite the same way as it had been in 1939. The scope of this presentation has been large for its relatively modest scale, and inevitably omissions would have been made. Nonetheless, I hope that you enjoyed listening to it and that it forms a sound framework for the building of future research. And now over to Harry.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Tom. I'm going to give you a break for a moment. So I'm going to focus on me whilst I tell our audience that our 2021 lecture series will kick off on the 4th of February, when Bill Pike will discuss the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close Britain came to Armageddon. Details of that are both on our events site, on the RAF Museum website, which is, as any of you who have used it will know, an absolute delight to use. But you can also find it through our Crowdcast channel, which is probably the easiest thing to do. And if you click on the RAF Museum logo at the top, it will take you to our channel feed, and you can subscribe, get updates of all of our lectures, and also go and see all of our upcoming events, which at the moment is just that one. But we do have 2 more scheduled for March. I can't help not being in focus, I'm afraid, everyone. It's just a pain you'll have to put up with for a moment, because Tom's going to come centre stage again in a moment. But yes, in March we have 2 lectures, one of which will be on women frontline service, and the other hopefully is with Lancaster University. We're just getting it confirmed, which will be on China and their use of jet power, which should be a fascinating talk. But Tom, I really enjoyed the talk. I'm going to get you back online, not least because I don't seem to be in focus, so I can't explain why, I'm afraid. But they'll have to put up with seeing you as opposed to me. But I really enjoyed the talk. We've had a few questions already, and I'd say to our audience, if you're interested in putting a question to Tom, you can do so using the Ask a Question function at the bottom. One of which came in, we might want to start with through the comments section, was how effective the Whitley was in terms of the Second World War. I think it's quite a nice area to start with because it shows some of the challenges Coastal Command faced using aircraft throughout the period, and the Whitley came from Bomber Command.
Yeah, so there are a number of aircraft that I didn't mention. I probably should have done, really, because they did do good work, that were designed as bombers, but were later introduced into Coastal Command. So the Whitley is one, and also the Wellington and the Hampden played important roles. I unfortunately haven't had time to look into how effective those types were, do any crunching of the statistics. But it's certainly an area I'd like to look at in future. Harry, if you know anything about it at all.
Well, I happen to have John Terrain's book here. I have the advantage of being able to just go and pick it out. I can say one of the great things, he crunches some of the numbers. Hudson at the start could operate out to 500 miles away from its base. And when the Wellington and the Whitleys come in, they can then go out to 500 miles from base and spend 2 hours at that distance. A huge transformation of the capabilities of Coastal Command just there. But when we put into perspective that range with what the Sunderland and then the Catalina can do, they can reach 600 miles and they can stay at that distance, I believe, for three hours. I have to double check. So Catalina can reach 800 miles. That's it. And stay there for 2 hours. The Liberator, in turn, can go out to 1,100 miles from its base and stay at that distance. It's a really important perspective that by the end of the war, Coastal Command has the tools to go and operate and stay out at distance in terms of conducting long-scale searches. The reason I think it's a really interesting point to start with is because it sort of shows that at the end of the Second World War, Coastal Command is able to fulfill a strategic niche and essentially take a role from the Navy, which land-based air power doesn't seem to have been able to do at the end of the First World War. I wonder, based on the research you've been able to do so far, do you feel that's because the RAF had lost the experience of the Royal Naval Air Service in many ways, because a lot of the officers went back to the Navy during the merger of the RFC and RNAS? Or do you just think it's the limitations of the aircraft at the time?
I think it's been of both, and also the period of time as well between the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War. That there wouldn't have been a great deal of people still in service with that relevant experience. So I think it's a range of factors coming into play, certainly.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. It's what I love Coastal Command, so I can just whisper on about it. And even one of the interesting areas which we often criticise the RAF for its inter-war performance in terms of development. But what Coastal Command shows is that it had a very good organisational structure to learn lessons and effectively build up a force again. And shown in terms of the size it reaches by the end of the war. And I wonder, do you feel that's really, despite the resources they keep at the end of the Second World War, do you feel that's still the most important thing that happens at the period between 45 to 49 and then into the Cold War? There's a good structure there to rebuild.
Yeah, they retained that baseline as a something to build foundations on. But it was also the repurposing into slightly different areas, which was keeping crews who may have had relevant experience from the Second World War. They were doing maybe more banal but still very important things like the air policing and the so-called.
Oh dear, Tom, I've lost you. I don't know if everyone else can still see Tom. Let's try and turn his video back on and off. I'm afraid unfortunately, I don't think that either Tom is gone or I have gone. If it's me that's gone, obviously you can't all hear me. If it's Tom that's gone, then we might be, yeah, Tom's gone. Okay, well, we might possibly call it a day then. I'll just pick up on the organisational point whilst I see if I can add Tom back in. See if we can get lucky. What I really like is if you read Dick John's biography. So I've invited Tom back onto the screen. We'll see if we can get him. He talked. Tom, are you back? No. He talked about coming into Coastal Command almost against his will because they needed to get better personnel in. There'd been a lag in terms of personnel going into Coastal Command. The brightest had been plucked into other commands, and the Sword of Honour winner from his year was taken into Coastal Command, and apparently he was distraught. And it's a really nice, interesting insight to see that despite Coastal Command having survived the Second World War, during the course of the Cold War, despite the fantastic work it was doing, it did once again, in many ways, become a Cinderella service. And there was a concerted effort to make sure that it got skilled personnel into it. Unfortunately, Tom doesn't seem to have rejoined us. I think it's a nice note just to say, read Dick John's autobiography. It's a fantastic read. One more go getting Tom back on, otherwise we'll have to. Okay, Tom, you come on this time. He's accepted and connecting. Let's see if he's on screen. Tom, are you back with us?
I hopefully.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Survived. Okay. By the skin of our teeth. All right. I'm going to put a mean question to you because you've upset me by going off screen. Given the resurgence of Russian and Chinese naval ambitions, does the current national investment in RAF anti-submarine capability bear more resemblance to 1924 or 1948?
Well, the numbers alone is obviously more similar to 1924. I think we can probably assume that the Poseidons are a lot more effective, certainly a lot more effective than something like a Supermarine Southampton. But then again, so are the Russian and the Chinese submarines. And I've not actually had much of the opportunity to look at current Russian and Chinese submarine capabilities, but they will have moved on. Nuclear submarines, proper submarines, not submersibles, not diesel electrics that you can put off just by flying a plane in the air. It's a whole different ball game. So if I was to opt for one, I would lean maybe towards 1924 rather than 1946.
I've been cruel. I think that's very unfair. I'm excited about the Poseidon. I think the RAF's electronic warfare capabilities in anti-subsurface warfare is pretty fantastic. Always have been since the Second World War. We've got a good question here, which is Sunderland's took far longer to make than Stirling's. Could a patrol version of the Stirling have done a better job than the Sunderland over the Atlantic?
That is an interesting question, and I don't entirely know. I think the Stirling probably had a slightly shorter range than the Sunderland without looking into it. The benefit as well of operating flying boats is this infrastructure issue that you can send them pretty much anywhere without the need to build a sophisticated runway and airfield facilities. The Sunderland was much better at protecting itself as well, with its nickname the Flying Porcupine, bristling with machine guns. I think it may have offered stiffer resistance in the way that a Stirling may not have done.
Yeah, it's a fantastic aircraft, Sunderland. I think should plug it. If anyone's not been to the museum in London, it's a fantastic exhibition. I was standing there the other day, and a small child ran around the corner and saw it. I went, "Wow, it's great."
Yeah, and you can go on board it in normal times. I don't know what the COVID safe measures are at the moment, but
they've closed it, unfortunately. It's a bit of a shame.
Okay, well,
so we've got a good question here, which is I want to slightly rephrase it. Is it right to compare the Southampton to the Shackleton?
It was a little bit unfair because obviously technology had moved on, but I think in terms of their capabilities, they're very different.
Okay. And then I've got a quick question here. I think it's, did the Navy ever try to get coastal aviation back after World War One and again after World War Two?
They certainly did after World War One. It was the cause of much bitter acrimony between the Admiralty and the Air Ministry, and many disagreements. There were probably still some elements at the end of the Second World War who wanted to get large portions of air elements back under naval control, but it definitely wasn't on the same scale as after the First World War.
Okay, Tom, I think I have to wrap it up there because I feel we've pushed our luck with the tech far enough. It's hitting 7 o'clock and I'm definitely due down at the pub. So wherever you are, whatever you're drinking, thank you very much for joining us. Do join us again in February, and all that's left is to thank you, Tom. And I hope the audience will join us in saying thank you very much.
Yep, thank you. Thank you all for attending.